With these challenges in mind, the American general named Westmoreland drew up a three-stage strategy that he was certain would guide the United States to victory by the end of the 1960s. The first stage, involving securing the situation and establishing an infrastructure to support a large modern army. Consider all the things that are needed to wage a serious war like this. You need to establish bases. They need to have decent roads so that you can get around. You've got to build bridges, all kinds of supply lines and networks. And the United States was actually quite successful in this stage. We built a very impressive infrastructure in South Vietnam. The second stage became the search and destroy missions. This began even in late 1965, but certainly 1966. And so this was going to be the foundation of a plan for weakening the enemy, seeking out the enemy, and beginning the process of wearing them down. As I've mentioned, and we will discuss a little bit more going forward, this stage was not as successful as stage one. There were certainly some successes in the process of search and destroy. We did locate and destroy many of the enemy. At the same time, there were lots of problems and lots of flaws with this plan as well. And then the third stage in the war was to be known as Vietnamization, which was a process of essentially handing over the war to the South Vietnamese themselves to fight. And we will discuss that a little bit later, but in the end, Vietnamization came to symbolize defeat for the United States as we got out and more or less left South Vietnam to its own devices. And so it's under this strategy that the war escalated. And as months went into years, the American response was essentially to grow increasingly violent and escalate the nature of the attacks. As Westmoreland said at one point, we'll just go on bleeding them until Hanoi wakes up to the fact that they've bled their country to the point of national disaster for generations. So there were many, many attacks trying to seek out the enemy, destruction of entire villages, very heavy bombing. The whole nature of this war resulted in many civilian casualties on both sides, and many really tragic and horrible mistakes were made. Remember that the Viet Cong, the enemy, are indistinguishable from the South Vietnamese, who are our friends and allies. And so it became a very difficult process of knowing who we needed to kill and who we needed not to kill. And so this leads to a lot of mistakes. One of the most notorious of these mistakes was the attack in a village called My Lai, which we will discuss a little bit more later. There was also extensive bombing, and most of the bombing occurred in South Vietnam. Remember, we're trying to destroy the Viet Cong. They are in the South. They are living in the same villages with the people we're trying to save. And so it was all too easy to bomb the wrong village, to destroy the wrong site, to kill innocent civilians. And finally, one of the programs we attempted to do was called Operation Ranch Hand, which was a massive effort to defoliate or to kill the jungles, which would drive the enemy out into the open where we could attack them more easily. We succeeded in killing millions of acres of jungle. We succeeded in dropping tons of chemicals like Agent Orange on the countryside. We didn't really succeed in making the war any easier to fight or in driving the enemy out into the open. They continued to find shelter wherever the jungle was left or to go into their tunnels underground. So the common theme in each of these is that put yourselves into the shoes or the thinking of the people of South Vietnam who we are trying to help in theory. We're making these horrible mistakes. We're killing civilians. We're bombing their villages. We're poisoning their countryside. We're killing off the vegetation and the jungles. These are the people we're trying to help. So for the South Vietnamese, it was very difficult for them to accept American influence. Very few of them certainly welcomed us with open arms, and a great many of them turned against the United States because we were doing so many awful things at the same time that we were theoretically trying to help them and save them from Ho Chi Minh and the communists. All of these kind of challenges and problems contributed to an erosion in the morale of American soldiers. There were all kinds of things that they had to deal with in this war that only exacerbated the problem of actually fighting the enemy himself. Weather was a great concern. The incredible heat and humidity, the rain. Remaining hydrated was a challenge. Finding supplies of clean water. Gastrointestinal issues wiped out many of our troops. Cleanliness was an issue. Foot problems were an issue. Again, their feet were constantly wet. Even changing socks 3-4 times a day seemed to do nothing to protect their feet. And perhaps you've had that sensation if you happen to run out through a rainstorm or something like that. It takes a little while before you can get your shoes off. When you take them off, what are your feet like? They're all wrinkled and shriveled up. Well, these guys, in some cases, you go to pull your sock off after standing in water for 2 days, and half of your foot comes off with it. So these were not just idle concerns. And so many soldiers began to doubt their purpose. We lose sight of the big picture. What are we fighting for? What are we here for? Well, in theory, we're there to, stop the next domino from falling and stop the spread of communism. But day to day, on the ground, many American soldiers began to doubt their purpose. And couple that with the fact that many of our soldiers were draftees who didn't want to go to the war in the first place, didn't support or believe in the war in the first place, and now they're out there certainly questioning their purpose. For their side, the North Vietnamese didn't have these kinds of problems. They never doubted their objectives. They had a very simple objective from the beginning to the end, and it relates to some of the quotes that I've already shared with you from Ho Chi Minh and other Vietnamese leadership. In essence, their goal was to keep fighting until the United States left, ultimately achieving independence. And that remained their crystal clear objective all throughout American involvement. As the Vietnamese general Van Nguyen Giap, and he is one of the great generals of the 20th century, Giap said, "The United States has a strategy based on arithmetic. They question the computers, add and subtract, extract square roots, and then go into action. But arithmetical strategy doesn't work here. If it did, they'd already have exterminated us. When a whole people rises up, nothing can be done." And so, indeed, we were confronted with a very determined, nearly unified enemy, at the same time as our own purpose and our own unity eroded by the day. The American response to these sorts of challenges was to seemingly always go bigger and go louder, using our superior technology and superior firepower to simply try to obliterate the enemy. This has come to be known by some historians, and there was a famous book written about Vietnam that used the phrase in its title of techno-war, essentially relying on superior firepower to just blow your enemy away. As has often been mentioned, the cavalry in the Vietnam War was helicopters. So we would ride in with the helicopters. The helicopters would drop our forces off, and then we would go to work. And so the war was very loud. It's this constant process of flying in, and then we're bombing, and then there's all the firepower. It's just this overwhelming display of technology and strength. But the enemy, for as quote-unquote primitive as their methods and their weaponry may have been, were very skilled at fighting with what they knew. And again, remember, this goes back through thousands of years of their history. This is what they do. They are constantly fending off outside invaders who may very well be stronger and more powerful, but they know exactly what to do. And so they would observe the flight patterns of the helicopters. They would begin to pick out where the landing zones were, and so they could be there and were very effective at launching attacks when the helicopters came in to land. The enemy also listened in on American radio traffic. Remember, I talked about the idea of chain of command and leadership, and so we were constantly radioing back and forth what we were doing, where we're going, and the enemy was listening in on that. One American officer put it this way. He said, "The enemy knew everything there was to know about us. They knew when we were going to strike, where we were going to strike, under what conditions, ground, air, or naval. This kind of information permitted the enemy to achieve results out of all proportion to relative commitment of firepower." The techno-war also provided many weapons for the enemy. When you're loaded down with all of these kind of weapons and supplies, and things begin to go awry, either stuff gets dropped and left behind on the battlefield, or dead bodies are left with all kinds of ammunition and weapons on them. But also, of the bombs that were dropped in this war, and there were many tens of thousands of bombs dropped, about 2% never detonated. And so they would just thud into the jungle or into the mud without exploding. And the enemy was very adept at finding these unexploded bombs, taking out the explosive goodie inside, and they would often make landmines out of those explosives. And so it was worse yet for our soldiers knowing that when they stepped on a landmine and were blown up or were badly wounded, to know that in all likelihood those explosives came from our own planes and our own forces. Again, it just eroded morale. One of the other things that we made increasing use of as the war deepened was the idea of free fire zones. And essentially what we would do in the free fire zones was to warn a village that we were coming, because we knew that, well, some of these people are on our side, many of them might be the enemy, so let's get out our allies. And so we would alert a village, tomorrow at 2 o'clock we're going to come back and destroy everything, in hopes that the people who were friendly to us would escape and survive. Well, of course, you can imagine so many things went wrong with this kind of plan, among them that you are telling your enemy where you're going to be and when you're going to attack. And so many of these kind of attacks resulted in surprise attacks from the enemy. So a final thought comes out of all of this, and a lot of the critics of the war at the time, but also in hindsight, and people who've written about the war, historians looking back on it, realize that you cannot bomb your way to victory in a place like Vietnam. And so why didn't we take more time and money and effort concentrating on pacification efforts, good things, building schools, building hospitals, trying to win over the people of Vietnam? Well, we did do some of this sort of thing. And I mentioned there was the building of infrastructure, and there were attempts to help. But understand, for every dollar spent on things like building hospitals and roads, many of which we were replacing stuff that we had already bombed into destruction. For every dollar we spent on those kind of positive things, we spent nearly $100 on the bombings, the military operations, and destruction.